And thanks for joining us for this special Faith Nation honoring Black History Month. I'm Jenna Bratter.
And I'm John Jessup. Well, 150 years ago after a long and bloody Civil War, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, abolishing slavery in the United States. Of course, the battle began many years before that with the abolitionist movement.
Thousands of men and women, black and white, risked everything for freedom. Charlene Aaron reports.
March 30th, 1849. A box arrives in Philadelphia with fugitive slave Henry Brown inside. Shipped from Richmond, Virginia, 27 hours earlier, he escaped with help from men on both sides of the racial divide.
The Underground Railroad was collaborative. You needed partners, you needed blacks and whites working jointly together to help people escape from slavery. People have seen the Underground Railroad as the first integrated resistance movement.
Anyone involved faced great risk. If caught, slaves were severely beaten and in some cases executed. Free blacks were sold into slavery. In the case of Henry Box Brown, he got away. But the white man who helped him served over 7 years in the Richmond Penitentiary.
If you assisted someone to escape from the Underground Railroad and you were white, you were seen as a far greater threat than a free black or an enslaved person. And so the punishment was extremely severe. In 1850 and 1860, you can look at the census records and see how many people were in the Virginia Penitentiary with the charge that they were helping someone try to escape.
But many were willing to take the risk, especially at the Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia. It was a key location in the Underground Railroad. Most fugitive slaves came from the Upper South, particularly Virginia and Maryland. The Anti-Slavery Society was founded in 1775 with members of both races. By 1838, they had their own building, but was burned to the ground after just 3 days, forcing them to go undercover. Society member William Still kept extensive records and published them after the Civil War in a book called The Underground Railroad. He gives examples of fugitives getting help in the form of homes, job training, money, even clothing.
By the 1830s, the northern factories were pumping out a type of cloth that was used in slave clothing. So you actually were branded by the clothing you had. So one of the first things you wanted to do once you got to the North is change your clothes.
Abigail Goodwin donated her best clothes. Still writes, her sister has often said that few beggars came to our doors whose garments were so worn, forlorn, and patched up as Abby's. Like a great many white abolitionists, Goodwin was a devout Quaker.
Originally, they called themselves Seekers of the Light, but they were given the name of Quakers because it was said that they trembled at the word of God.
Their battle against slavery came from core beliefs, originating with founder George Fox.
He came to the belief that there was that of God in every person. That's the wording that he used. There is that of God in every man.
Quakers signed the first anti-slavery resolution in the American colonies.
The most important thing about Quakers is that you live your values, and they tried to do that in every aspect of their lives, whether it was buying produce that was not made, grown or created by enslaved people, whether it was wearing garments that were not produced from cotton.
This is the Appoquinimink Meeting House, built in 1785. Just 20 square feet, it is presumably the smallest brick house of worship in America. But the Bible says, despise not small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin.
This was a preparative meeting, which meant that this was where people came weekly for their worship.
In the attic, where children met for Sunday school, is a hiding place for runaway slaves. Harriet Tubman is said to have stayed here. Tubman collaborated often with Thomas Garrett, a member of the Appoquinimink Meeting. Garrett helped over 2,000 runaway slaves make their way to freedom. Fined heavily, his home was put up for auction. The sheriff said, "Thomas, I hope you will never be caught at this again." Garrett's reply was typical of most agents in the Underground Railroad. "Friend, I haven't a dollar in the world, but if thee knows a fugitive who needs breakfast, send him to me." Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Well, the name Uncle Tom is usually used as a racially charged stereotype, but the primary inspiration for the book Uncle Tom's Cabin was a real man.
And as I learned reporting this next story, he was a man who lived an extraordinary life. When Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1852, the anti-slavery novel flew off the shelves. 17 printing presses ran 24 hours a day to keep up with the demand, making it the best-selling novel of the 19th century.
The book struck at our emotions as a nation, and it made us see ourselves. It was our emotional mirror, and it prompted some individuals to rethink how they thought of slavery.
Uncle Tom's Cabin has been cited as a factor leading to the Civil War. When Abraham Lincoln later met the author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, he reportedly said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." In 1852, the backlash was immediate and powerful.
In the South, the book was banned. And if you were caught selling the book, you were either going to be killed or thrown in prison. There was tremendous fear that this book would make a difference.
It did by portraying Uncle Tom as a dignified, intelligent, God-fearing man. In the South, however, traveling Tom shows became popular, depicting him as a submissive buffoon, happy in his enslaved condition, a stereotype that still exists today. There were also attempts to discredit Harriet Beecher Stowe. The author countered with a key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, an exhaustive bibliography of the real people behind her fictional characters. It included her primary inspiration for Uncle Tom.
Josiah Henson was an individual who demonstrated extraordinary courage. He tried to help other people, especially whites in this country, to understand the reality of slavery.
Josiah Henson's story begins here in Rockville, Maryland, on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Now, this suburban neighborhood was once a 570-acre plantation, and the house behind me is where the owner lived, a man named Isaac Riley.
In this time period, masters wanted to present themselves to be very benevolent, these patriarchs who cared about their people that were enslaved, but the presentation that Henson gives us was that didn't happen for Isaac Riley.
I faithfully served Riley for many years. He was coarse and vulgar in his habits, and unprincipled and cruel in his general deportment.
Henson's autobiography provides many examples of Riley's cruelty, like the day he discovered a book on grammar hidden in 9-year-old Josiah's cap.
When Riley saw the book, of course, he was outraged because it was unheard of that his enslaved people would learn to read and write.
"Pick up that book," he cried, using an awful oath. At last I was obliged to do it, when he beat me across the head and back till my eyes were swollen and I became unconscious.
Despite the harsh treatment, Henson proved to be trustworthy. Eventually elevated to overseeing the plantation, he was able to ease the harsh conditions faced by his fellow slaves. When he was 18, he was even allowed to attend a revival meeting. Although not permitted to enter the church, he heard a life-changing message from preacher John McKinney.
He said, "Jesus Christ, the Son of God, tasted death for every man." It touched my heart, and I cried out, "I wonder if Jesus Christ died for me." Again and again did the preacher reiterate the words, "for every man." Oh, the blessedness and sweetness of feeling that I was loved.
And that meant a lot to him because he knew that God would always be on his side. He would deliver him, and he would decide his plan in life.
The plan included moving his family and 18 others to Isaac Riley's brother's home in Kentucky. When they got to Cincinnati, Henson found his faithfulness tested. Although Ohio was a free state and many free black men encouraged them to stay, he stood firm.
He felt like he had been tasked with this duty, and he was going to fulfill it. He had taken care of them, and they felt like if he wants us to carry along, we'll go with him.
Henson came to regret that decision. 3 years after their arrival in Kentucky, those who followed him were put up for auction.
Husbands and wives, parents and children were to be separated forever. From that hour, I saw through, hated, and cursed the whole system of slavery. One absorbing purpose occupied my soul: to gain freedom, self-assertion, and deliverance from the cruel caprices and fortunes of dissolute tyrants.
Because of Henson's management skills, he and his family were initially allowed to stay together. 2 years later, however, his time had come. The only option: escape. A major obstacle was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which meant he and his family could be captured even in a free state. So he set his sights on Canada.
It was a 600-mile journey that he would have to make on foot with his wife and 4 children, traveling by night, sleeping by day, super dangerous. But he knows he's got to go to Canada. It's the only place that he can truly be a free man.
His wife made a sling for Josiah to carry the 2 youngest children on his back. With only the North Star as their guide, the Henson family began their journey. After 40 grueling days, they arrived at Lake Erie just across the water from Canada. A sympathetic ship captain offered to take them the rest of the way.
He put his hand on my head and said, "Be a good fellow, won't you?" I felt streams of emotion running down in electric courses from head to foot. "Yes," said I, "I'll use my freedom well."
Henson helped start a black settlement in Ontario, including a multiracial school, almost unheard of at the time. To raise money and awareness, he preached throughout the United States and England, where he was granted a private audience with Queen Victoria. During those years, he risked his life to help a total of 118 slaves reach freedom in Canada.
He's an inspiration for me personally, and I hope for many people as they hear this story, to use our freedom well, right? To use our resources, our time, our money, our energy, our voice, our influence, to use it on behalf of those with less than us.
And near the end of his life, Josiah Henson visited the plantation he once managed. Although many of his experiences there were unimaginably painful, Josiah later recalled he could see God's hand in them all.
Coming up, we'll meet the hidden figure behind the GPS. Well, you might not know her by name, but Gladys West has made a lasting impact on our world.
Born in 1930 into a farming family in a community of Virginia sharecroppers, the military inducted West into the United States Air Force Hall of Fame last year.
This woman's remarkable rise is a tribute to her hard work. And as you'll see in this next story, that hard work has forever changed the way we all get around.
Whether it's navigating jet airliners, providing directions to a new restaurant, or geotagging your social media pictures, few imagine the impact GPS would have on modern society, including 88-year-old Gladys West.
I never would have thought that I could sit in a car and, it says, turn left, turn right. No.
For 42 years, Gladys was employed by the U.S. Navy. As a mathematician, she would help lay the groundwork for many of the government's orbital satellite projects. That includes what became the Global Positioning System, or what we call GPS.
We didn't do all the GPS stuff that's for the car and all, we didn't actually do that, but what we did was got the accuracy of where things were located all around the world and stuff in its database.
Born in 1930, Gladys grew up on her family's farm just south of Richmond, Virginia, where she learned the value of hard work. And that would pay off for Gladys, who wanted more than what life on a country farm could offer.
You could get a scholarship if you were the first or second in your high school graduating class. So right off, I was Johnny on the spot, doing all my work all the time.
She finished at the top of her high school class, earning her a full scholarship to what was then called Virginia State College, a historically black school in Petersburg, Virginia.
The teachers were encouraging me to major in math because they thought that I would be good.
Again, Gladys finished at the top of her class and went on to complete her master's. In 1956, she accepted a job at the Naval Support Facility in Dahlgren, Virginia. The space race was just taking off, and computers were the wave of the future.
It was really an excitement, you know. The promises that they would teach us, you know, how to communicate with this computer and all this stuff, you know. So, knowing me, I was ready to, to work hard with it.
And work hard she did. With the success of the space program, NASA was beginning to place satellites into orbit. Gladys was tasked to help write and program code needed to process the enormous amount of data coming in.
You have a long equation and there are certain coefficients that go along with each term. You have to generate them, get them accurate and all. Our program encoded all those equations, and we checked them out by hand cases and all. And they were passed on to the next level.
The work was long and tedious. Every equation checked and rechecked for accuracy.
You didn't want to cause anybody else any holdups or any trouble about something that you had done that prevented them from making progress. So you want to have to make sure that they could depend on anything that you sent.
It was this tenacity and dedication that drew the attention of fellow mathematician Ira West. The two dated for 18 months before getting married in 1957.
She wasn't an easy catch, you know. Let me tell you, I had to work hard for that.
I always think of Ira, and I always tell me, I said, he played more than I did.
Meanwhile, the civil rights movement was sweeping the country. Gladys and Ira wanted to show their support, but government employees weren't allowed to participate in public demonstrations. So the couple decided the best way to help was to change perceptions and work even harder.
We just were pushing. We couldn't participate directly, but indirectly in the situation.
That was another reason why I felt that I always had to be my best, and I always had to be a role model.
In the years that followed, they both continued their work for the Navy on numerous projects. In 1978, Gladys received a commendation for her work and was promoted to project manager of the CSAT radar altimetry project, the first satellite that could collect data across the ocean's surface.
It was always interesting. We were working with people and doing something that was important and that's going to be used by the government and all. You got to make sure you're doing everything right because you're part of this big thing that's happening.
As she always had, Gladys stayed true to herself, striving to be defined by her competence and not by the color of her skin.
I think I was most happy when I got to the point that I could be independent and I could troubleshoot big programs and be a help to the analysts who had helped to generate the program. When I could talk to them, you know, it's sort of like be a part and understand. I think that was the best feeling I had.
Even after retiring in 1998, Gladys stayed busy, completing her PhD in philosophy and writing her memoirs. For all of her accomplishments, commendations, and recognition she has received over her career, Gladys understands there is only one who she can credit for the direction her life has taken.
I think everybody should have God in their lives so they understand. And I can just about see the complete circle. And I can go back and I can look and see what he did and where he put me and where all along. And I was thinking, it's just amazing that I didn't understand at the time exactly what was happening, but he was there and he was doing it.
When we come back, the story of one man who was willing to risk everything to help find freedom for others.
Well, every February for the last 45 years, Americans have observed Black History Month.
But as Charlene Aaron discovered, some stories cannot be told in just black or white.
By most accounts, Dr. Bertice Berry has led a successful life. Born in poverty, she earned a PhD, became a nationally syndicated talk show host, and best-selling author. Along the way, though, she made what she calls one of her greatest errors.
It would bring it up. Yeah. It would bring it up.
In her novel, Redemption Song, she names her villain an evil slaveholder after a real man, John Hunn.
Old man Hunn wasn't so old then. He was out hunting my mama and me. He wasn't a real catcher. Others caught slaves for money. He caught them for keeps. John Hunn, I knew the story. I heard the name that he owned the plantation that our family lived on during slavery.
Despite her mother's repeated objections, Dr. Berry believed Hunn owned her ancestors.
Especially in the 60s and 70s, you know, back when we were slaves, you know, that was my slave name. And my mother would say, we were not slaves. I'm like, oh, you're having a slave fantasy. Delaware was a slave state.
But one day she came upon the PBS documentary, Whispers of Angels, about the Underground Railroad.
Burris eventually guided them to the home of the young Quaker, John Hunn, in Middletown.
Eventually, he became known as the chief engineer of the Underground Railroad in Delaware. So he was very well known, and people would, that were helping the slaves escape would say, go see John Hunn.
John Hunn helped as many as 200 fugitive slaves make their way to freedom.
John Hunn's father and uncle were the owners of this property. They inherited it in 1794.
Historian Robin Krawitz has studied John Hunn for the past 20 years. She learned that his father, Ezekiel Hunn, also helped runaway slaves escape.
He had funded an African-American boatman to ferry people from here and from the St. Johns River over to New Jersey, which was the closest point of freedom.
His son, however, had other plans as a young man. After training to be a silk merchant, he visited his older sister, Patience, a devout Quaker. She took one look at his fancy clothes and said, "Throw off thy Babylonish garment."
And she basically read him the Riot Act and said, you know, come back to the faith, be who you are. And it took.
John Hunn was 27 years old when he became involved with the Underground Railroad. It was a cold, snow-covered day like this. He was washing his hands at a pump outside his home when he saw an unfamiliar covered wagon approach.
There was a group of people who were escaping enslavement from Queen Anne's County in Maryland, traveling all night in a wagon and on foot. He brought in the women and children into the house, and then the men went out into the barn, and they were all housed and warmed up and fed, and then to get them ready to continue on their journey.
John Hunn's house here.
But a neighbor turned them in to the local magistrate. While they eventually made their way to freedom, John Hunn was prosecuted in federal court. Under the fugitive slave law, it was a federal crime to assist runaway slaves, and slave owners could sue anyone who did so. In this courthouse, John Hunn was brought before Judge Robert Tawney. Tawney would later write the infamous Dred Scott decision, ruling that African Americans did not have civil rights protected by the U.S. Constitution.
Well, he didn't contest the charges. He said, yeah, I did it. So he was heavily fined.
Hunn's world fell apart. He lost everything. His family had to move in with relatives, and his 6-year-old son died after a long illness. Still, Hunn steadfastly continued his work.
I think his calling was so strong, and he felt this issue was such an important issue that he didn't feel he could stop.
On his deathbed, Hunn ordered his son to burn all records of his activity in the Underground Railroad. He wrote, "I ask no other reward for any efforts made by me in the cause than to feel that I have been of use to my fellow men. No other course would have brought me peace of mind."
It was a shock. I've used this man's name, who is the southernmost conductor of the Underground Railroad, who remained hidden the same way we do with everything. We think everything is black and white, good and evil, sin and righteous. You know, no. You know, there's so much more to every story if you just look a little further.
And that she did, determined to set the record straight Barry wrote The Ties That Bind, a memoir of race, memory, and redemption.
If you had the opportunity to speak to him face to face, what would you say?
To John Hunt? Oh, wow, dude, you are so cool. Thank you. And while the laws are against you now, years from now, everyone will know that you're right.
Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Well, thanks for joining us for this Faith Nation special.
Have a great evening.